Hi, folks. It's today, TAS Australia, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about how society declines. Now, Western society, I don't think there's any doubt, is in fairly severe decline in many ways, whether it be moral, as in the complete sense of futility that so many people have now in the West, or the false belief that if only we have more LGBTQ flags, then somehow a utopia, which the simple-minded have been led to believe is just around the corner. If only we have more LGBTQ flags, and that's it, utopia will be achieved. Well, who's in the way of all this? Who's stopping the LGBTQ flags? Well, straight white Christian males are stopping it. Therefore, if we kill all of them and get rid of them, then we will have utopia. So this is, of course, very creating social division on a grand scale that we haven't really seen before. Social division, previously, as much as it did exist, was always tiny minorities that were being distanced, persecuted, othered, whatever you want to call it. This time, in this social division, it's the actual majority that's being persecuted by an ideologically captured minority. And in terms of social division type architecture, this is probably a first in world history, I would think. You could argue there were similarities, say, when the Normans conquered England by that very close run thing, the Battle of Hastings, that they were a small sort of group of nobles and lords, and they had the armed forces sort of under their control, that they dominated the primarily Celtic Saxon population, and but they still needed those people, so that there was class division without the sort of persecution that we would associate with, say, a small minority that could be religious or something like that. So the very architecture of social division has changed. But coming back to the issue of societal decline, now there are some that take the view that historians among them that really societal decline happens with a huge bang, a huge apocalyptic event, and this is rather drawn from sort of biblical context, which is the four horsemen of the apocalypse. What's it? Famine, pestilence, disease, and war or something. Can't remember what they all are, but anyway, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And this suggests a calamitous event, a huge plague or something like that is going to destroy a society or wound it to such an extent that it dies shortly afterwards. So the horseman of the apocalypse thing, which again has its biblical, I think it came out of Revelations from memory. Now, there are various other schools of thought that suggest that societal decline really doesn't happen that way. It can, but it really the way it really happens is from death by 1,000 cuts. Many of those self-inflicted, so that the society is so weakened and so unable and so feeble to defend itself that it falls over at the first sort of challenge to its position or authority. It could be an invasion coming in, but that invasion doesn't need to be huge, substantial, or well organized or anything like that, because the society is so weak and enfeebled at this point. It goes down, like a sack of shit as soon as there's a bit of pressure applied. So, and this is, I think, the more likely scenario. When we look at the Roman Empire, it staggered along in a very weakened state for quite some time, and then when finally there was tested and was put under pressure by the Huns, that sort of thing, and even the Eastern Roman Empire later on, it wasn't a particularly formidable force that caused the empire to collapse. But at that stage, the futility had set in. No one willing to really fight or risk or sacrifice themselves for the ideal of the empire or that society. And so they all just so really put their hands up in the air and allowed the infiltration, as in military infiltration in the end, to finish them off. And again, I've mentioned this previously, that Rome, the eternal city of 1 million people, the center of the Mediterranean universe at least. Years later, when a British traveller an English traveller was coming through, and he's a bit of a history buff, this guy. I think it was in the 1400s or something like that. And was going through Rome, and or maybe a bit earlier, but he noticed that all the great buildings, the Colosseums, the Roman Senate, were all overgrown with weeds, with goats and grazing through it, cats running around, rats everywhere, a few goat herders. That was in a population in Rome of 30,000. So it'd gone from over 1 million down to 30,000. And this guy couldn't believe, as he wrote, he couldn't believe the magnificence of Rome that once had been, and to look at it now, just a bunch of dilapidated buildings overgrown with weeds and so on. So that can be how calamitous the collapse of a society can be, whether it's spread out over hundreds of years or not. I wanted to talk particularly about not the apocalyptic end to a society or nation state or whatever you want to call it, but rather an empire, but rather the death by 1,000 cuts, which I think is the more likely scenario, certainly what we're seeing in the West today. Now, the moral decline, as in, again, going on biblical terms, where everybody's getting drunk and partying and engaging in, endlessly lecherous events and I don't know, orgies or something like that. That's not really I'm sure you could find examples of it, but that's not really the bedrock, the underlying baseline cause of societal decline. It's the social division that our elites are desperately and actively and aggressively fomenting, turning straight people against non-straight people, turning men against women, turning, pro-abortionists against anti-abortionists. And the list goes on. And wherever there can be a social divide of any sort, then these forces, the globalist cabal, I call them generically, are exploiting and aggressively exploiting these divisions, claiming if we can get rid of these divisions, then there's a utopia just around the corner, whereas they've created these very divisions themselves, and there's no utopia around the corner, nor will there ever be. So, but I wanted to talk about, again, this death by 1,000 cuts. Recently, even as a young man, it wasn't, even in school. So I'll go back to, say, high school, as we're getting a bit older. So I'm talking sort of more middle school into senior high school type age range. We were, so many of us, filled with an optimism of what we were going to achieve, what we were going to accomplish. We were going to do great things, find the cure for cancer, solve problems. When I say solve problems, I mean as in we were going to, make sure. We were hopelessly naive, I guess, naive at the time, but we were going to improve the justice system so that the innocent would never be found guilty. That was very much in our minds, as much as we thought about justice at the time. We were very much fixated on that. Students, even as a kid, students who were, say, not very bright, that they should have access to state-funded coaching to help them, things like that. So there was even a slight touch of communism, I guess, in some of the things we're thinking of. We were going to, again, find the cure for cancer. We were going to do this and do that. The idea was to improve on what was working reasonably well. Not that it was perfect, but to improve on it and fix things that were broken and make things work better. And that was really and we were optimistic about that. We were going to achieve, again, great things and do wonderful things. And that, the cure for cancer thing was quite starry-eyed, but we hoped for things like, rockets to the moon and, rockets to Mars and wherever. And these were the type of very optimistic, the future is bright. We're going to, all be part of something that is big and exciting and optimistic and the like. So, and many of it, not all, but many of us thought about that, the merit that if we want to do better at school, we just had to hit the books and work harder and study harder and do revision and, these sorts of things. And I thought this was a fairly normal way of looking at the world. People that were just dumb and nothing could be done about their dumbness. They would end up sweeping the floor and cleaning the toilets, but that was okay, because that was like the natural organic order of things. So we also subscribed to a view the natural organic nature, the idea that the people would not select their government, for example, as I got older now, through high school, college, and getting older, like that sort of thing, that equality before the law and people will choose their own government by voting, that. And I say democracy in a generic term, whether it's a republic or not, but the idea that the people will select their government. These sorts of things were just how it was, and we would improve on it, and we would be part of that cohort of people that would make things better, and would be even more functional, more efficient than they had been. These sorts of things. Now, that sort of positiveness, can-do attitude, I noticed that going around, because at a quite young age, I was traveling the world on business and that sort of thing. So I remember going to the United States for the first time, and again going through Silicon Valley, and that would have been the apex of positive can-do, inventing the future type thinking. But so I was around a lot of people that were sort of predisposed, very bright people who were predisposed to that positive outlook, and I found that can-do attitude just everywhere. It didn't matter where I went. It could be Texas or California or New York. Not so much in New York, because even then there was a lot of social justice type activism and so on there, and the Northeast generally. But you could see that positiveness. So where did that go? Because it's gone from that optimistic, positive, can-do. We're going to make the world an actual better place for everybody. Democracy and voting that really works, law that won't allow the innocent to go to prison, and inventions that will make people's lives, cars that work better, and this sort of thing. So that was all very, very positive. And the idea of giving good service in a shop, and the idea of saying, well, if I don't do the best I can, that means that load has to be carried by one of my fellow citizens. So therefore, it's my duty to them to do the best I can, and that sort of thing. And now we've gone to a situation today where those sort of sentiments would be laughed out of the room. I mean, you'd be, if you're not called an idiot, they'd call you a Nazi. So, why now is it that the most important issues are how many gay, lesbian flags are flying, how many transgender people are being used to go into schools and educate 5-year-olds on ideological fanaticism and lunacy. Why are those now the priorities? Why are the priorities doing on some vague ideological notion of restorative justice and so on and so forth? So the world, or Western world at least, has completely lost its way with the things that matter. So now, all across the Western world, and this has happened uniformly across the Western world, everywhere you go, the roads are potholed. Why is it that suddenly in every Western country, white majority country, that they can't even fix the roads anymore? Why is it when you go into if you've got an emergency in a hospital waiting room, you could get in there in 10 minutes years ago, whereas today you can be waiting 5, 6, 7, 8 hours to see a doctor. I mean, the list goes on of breakdowns in service. Why is merit? Why do you go to meetings, business meetings, and find there's no one in the room who's got a fucking clue what they're doing, and yet they're all running around very entitled. So this is restorative justice. You have to give all these jobs to black lesbians. Merit be damned. Do you think merit should decide this? You damn Nazi, and so on. So the perversions of what once were pretty concrete, sensible, workable values have all been lost, and or most of them anyway, or had to go underground. And I think this is where the death by 1,000 cuts and societal degradation occurs. Once you get these views, that have become now mainstream and widely practiced, whether it be in government or any institution or anywhere, the self-hatred and these sorts of things, particularly hatred towards the majority and hatred towards the people that built the world, then this is the degradation path. Now, also, I want to just sort of comment on the sense of futility, where I was talking about how positive and optimistic everybody was, or many people were, not everybody, but many people were, years ago, certainly in my youth. The sense of futility today, why bother? Who cares? Now, there are people that there's some divisions here. Given how evil and Nazi and fascist the world is, why should I bother? Everything's so bad. The Nazis are everywhere, and Nazis, and so why should I bother? I can't really do anything worthwhile until those Nazis are killed, and so on and so forth. So it's the sense of futility is saying, why bother? Why should I give a fuck? Now, even people that are capable of optimism and capable of real contribution may look, well, why should I care? Why should I get married and have children? The government can steal my house from me at any time, and there's nothing I can do to stop it or prevent it or limit it. So why should I bother? Why should I take that risk if I want to do good for society? So wherever you look now, they're doing good for society generally. And I don't mean gay, lesbian flags down the main street, but doing good for society generally. And it could be finding the cure for cancer. That's viewed as the act of a Nazi today. Or that, well, all you're doing is depriving a black lesbian of that job, and so on. So this sense of futility has crept in, not only with people who are parasitic and useless anyway, but their view that why should, they can be entitled to something, but why should they work for it? Why should they put in their time, effort? Why should they risk anything? Why should they risk failure? And so on. So that this omnipresent, all-pervasive sense of futility is creeping in across all sections of society now, and it's being I would argue, actively fostered by the attitudes of creating social division, which the knock-on effect of which has been this futility, and this is the essential component of societal death by 1,000 cuts. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback Channel. Thank you for listening.